Live, and we'll be making the video available online as a result. All right. Not Your Grandfather's Art History is a digital reader of art history essays, made possible in part by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The BIPOC Reader is still growing and is currently comprised of 18 essays written by 20 scholars and artists with a global focus that draws on the traditions, an amazingly wide array of traditions, from the Dene to the Silk Roads to colonial Brazil to ancient Nubia to South Asia to images of Africans drawn by Mashika artists as early as 1530. It's really mind-blowing. The BIPOC Reader is a free and open resource written to be accessible and welcoming and designed to open doors and encourage students to explore the history of art, a history of art that is inclusive enough that students can recognize their own traditions. I want you to please welcome with me Olivia Chiang, Professor of Art History at Connecticut State College, where she's taught since 2011. Since 2014, she has focused on increasing the diversity of artists, cultures, and works represented in introductory art history courses, as well as on ensuring the accessibility of art history courses and materials to all students. Olivia is the BIPOC Readers Project Director and publication editor. It is really her invention and her contribution, along with the wonderful people that she put together. And please welcome Maya Harakawa, Assistant Professor at the University of Toronto, where she teaches on art of the African diaspora, modern and contemporary art of the United States. She received her PhD from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and has taught at multiple campuses in both the city and state university systems in New York. Maya is author of the BIPOC Readers Resource for Teachers. We're going to start with some brief introductions, a little information about the project, about the resource for teachers, and then really mostly open it up for questions. I hand it over.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much for those introductions. And yes, I want to thank Dr. Harakawa, Maya, for being here and for hosting this webinar with us. And thank you all for attending. I know it's a busy time of the semester for those of us who are teaching, and a special thank you to all my colleagues in the Connecticut State Community College system. So thank you guys for joining. I don't want to talk too much. Like Stephen said, we really want this to be open to questions and to really have a conversation to hear your experiences in the classroom, some of the challenges you might be experiencing right now, some of the questions you might be having, particularly when it comes to incorporating material that can be heavy, that can include conversations about constructions of race and erasure, questions of how the whole field of art history came about, and how the canon became established, and the inherent challenges and problems with teaching from a canonical approach. So I just want to give a little background to the project. Some of you might be more familiar with it than others, but this really came out of my own teaching experience. I teach at a community college. I've been there over a decade now, and it's been an incredible journey. And part of that journey was seeing the limitations for my students and for my teaching in terms of using traditional textbooks. I found that for most of my students, the cost was prohibitive, that they could not afford, or it was very challenging and difficult for them to have to pay for any course materials, really. And so I found that was really a barrier to their engagement with the course, and to their success in a way of a course being structured around a textbook. I also got to the point where I really could not teach from a canonical approach anymore, at least not exclusively, because of the lack of representation, and particularly my students not being able to see themselves in the material that was being presented. And I also had issues with voice and who was doing the interpretation in a lot of standard textbooks. So I set off on this project where I wanted to have scholars of color largely be the authors of an accessible anthology of essays, to be able to present their research, and or to be able to write on topics that I felt like really needed an easily accessible, easily digestible essay or article for students in their early years in the collegiate level or high school as well. And so that was the impetus for the project. And I also felt it was really, really important that my authors be compensated for their work. So that's a major part of this project as well. And thanks to the funding from the NEH, we've been able to compensate each of our authors for their contributions to this project, for their work. So I hope for the audience of Smart History of this project that you guys will be able to use it as a supplement or a support to what you're teaching. And it's designed really to be easily integrated into survey courses, if that's what you're teaching. And I'm so grateful to Maya for writing this teaching resource guide for us. And she'll talk more about that. And I just, again, wanted to thank her, to thank everyone for being here today and for sharing your experiences and your questions with us today. So thanks. And Maya, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Olivia. I just want to begin by extending the thanks that you ended with. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this amazing project that is the BIPOC Reader for Smart History, and to Stephen and Beth for hosting this project and sort of understanding. Stephen and I were talking before we came on today about how it just makes so much sense that a project like this, which is about rethinking the core values of art history, would take place in something like the Smart History in terms of its levels of accessibility. It's an amazing teaching resource. So thank you to Beth and Stephen for facilitating that. And thank you so much to Kayla, who's doing the tech work behind the scenes and made sure that we were all prepared and ready to bring this webinar to all of you. And thank you so much to everybody who showed up. It's really amazing to see how many people are here. It's heartening to see that people are invested in not just the topic of changing or rethinking the survey or thinking art history, but also the questions of teaching that necessarily append it. So I was really excited when Olivia asked me to participate in the project generally, but specifically to write a essay about teaching. Just a little bit of background on me and why this project was particularly appealing to me. I primarily researched the art of the African diaspora in the United States in the 20th century, and mostly in the post-war period. But I think for me, this interest in terms of my research is really grounded in just a larger commitment to social justice. And I see art history, even though it maybe not has been historically, but I see that it has the potential to be a really powerful tool for not only, untangling or disentangling, rethinking critically about white supremacy and other forms of oppression, but also a way to validate and uplift the voices of those who contest those forms of power. So given that that's my underlying interest or investments in the discipline, I think it makes total sense that this project, or it's very exciting for me to participate in this project, I should say. And so I want to give a little bit of background on the essay that I wrote for the reader, just maybe give some information about how I approached it. And then, since maybe not everybody's had the opportunity to read it ahead of time, just to go through it relatively schematically and just to highlight some of the major points that I emphasized in the essay. And then, but as I think both Stephen and Olivia mentioned, really to use most of the time as about a conversation to hopefully hear from people about their experiences or to answer questions. So as Olivia mentioned, the sort of underlying core of the BIPOC Reader is because it's about dismantling white supremacy or thinking really explicitly about how whiteness structures both art history and then more generally, our lives and worlds. Some of the conversations that this reader might engender would be difficult in many different respects, whether that's because about the difficulty of expanding our knowledge base as educators to teach topics that we might not feel we have expertise in, or because the conversations raise issues that could be deemed contentious amongst students. I talk about in the introduction about how for a lot of students grappling with some of the issues around white supremacy and its effects, requires relinquishing privilege on their part, and that can be difficult for them and produce resistance. It's also, I think, really important to mention that the difficulty might be coming from administrators or other power brokers within our educational institutions who might not want these histories to be discussed in the classroom. Unfortunately, that's an increasing concern. So I think it's really important to acknowledge all the levels of difficulty that come with this type of material. But at the same time, given, again, what I talked about, my investments in art history being, it's really important to me that these difficulties aren't roadblocks that prevent these types of discussions from happening or this material from getting out there. So that's where I am invested in questions of pedagogy, but I also want, in terms of what we do in the classroom and how we can not just integrate this material, but to create a classroom environment where this type of material can be taught. But I also want to emphasize that even though I think about pedagogy a lot, it's something that's really important to me, the practice of teaching. But I'm not someone who comes from a background in education. My background is firmly in art history. And I'm only mentioning this in terms of as a preface for the sort of perspective that I took around the essay, which I will be more explicit about later. So I don't feel comfortable teaching from speaking rather from a teaching practices type of perspective in a sort of maybe more concrete way, thinking about it a little bit more abstract and sort of larger ideas, and again, beginning a type of conversation. But I was very lucky that I went to a graduate program that emphasized pedagogy. There was a lot of opportunities to teach at a very early stages in the program. And also, I mentioned this in the introduction to my essay, but it's not just that I had a lot of opportunities to teach, but I taught very specific types of students. As Stephen mentioned, I taught at both the city and state university systems in New York. These are public schools that primarily serve students of color, mostly from working lower class backgrounds. Many of them are the first in their families to go to college. Many of them don't speak English, was not their first language, or English wasn't spoken in the home. So this was very instructive to me in terms of how I approach thinking about what the art history classroom is, and again, a larger interest in what art history can do. So the reflections that I wrote in the essay are sort of a combination of these personal experience that I had teaching in the classroom, and again, teaching a particular type of students, and this combination of sort of my research background and sort of the lessons that I had learned through engagements, particularly with Black studies, but sort of a larger body of theory that is thinking through questions of identity, oppression, whiteness, and race in particular. So that's kind of a larger schematic, again, overview of how I approached the essay. And I should note that Kayla has been kind enough to link the essay in the chat. So if you wanted to look at it, you can either skim it now or bookmark it for later. But I figured with the rest of the time, I would just, again, go over some of the main bullet points. And something that's really important, though, that I mentioned in the introduction, and I want to just reiterate here, is that the essay isn't really meant to be prescriptive in any way. It's not, I didn't approach it from the perspective of, I have the answers because I have all sorts of experience. It doesn't mean it's not meant to be definitive. And it's not necessarily that what I would suggest is anything better than what anybody else would come up with. So this is why I think it's really exciting for us to sort of have a conversation and share questions and strategies together. And I also don't want to claim these ideas as mine or that I originated them. There's definitely people who have been doing this work much longer than I have, and many people who will continue to do this work. And again, that's why I think it's really exciting that we have opportunity to discuss and share together. But if it is helpful, I'm happy to share sort of explicit examples from my own teaching that relate to any of the topics that I highlight in the essay, just in case some of these things still might seem a little bit abstract. So just to go into the essay, the first part of the first body point, I guess, in the essay is sort of starting at the beginning and thinking about why we teach art history. And if we sort of ask this questions to ourselves as educators very explicitly, how that might be a way to sort of rethink how we integrate questions about whiteness and race and oppression. And for me, I mentioned that what's really important to me is that thinking about art history and the ability through the lens of power, who has power to be represented, who has the power to represent, etc. And if we do this, and this can really be we make this also explicit for our students, that we show the students that this is why we're teaching them art history, it really becomes natural to talk about questions of race and other forms of hierarchy and oppression. So it's not like we're trying to add this issue of whiteness or power on top of that. It becomes integral to our understanding of what art history does. And if we show that to students from the beginning, they'll understand that this is what all art history can do for them. I also have a section where I talk about what it means to actually teach about whiteness. And I think it's very important to understand that whiteness is not a topic. It's not about calling out whiteness or identifying it as an object, but thinking more about whiteness as an ideology that shapes all aspects of life. And in that way, it's important to talk about also how it's imbricated in other forms of oppression. So if we're only talking about whiteness by itself, we're missing all the pernicious ways in which white supremacy functions. It relates to hierarchies around gender, it relates to questions of class, etc. So I think it's really important that we, again, make this explicit for our students, that how we're thinking about whiteness is not something that necessarily can be identified or is about individual people, but it's about this larger system. And then that really is a way for us to teach them what it means to see whiteness is not about looking at an image of a white person necessarily, but a landscape painting can be about whiteness, for example. A piece of pottery can be about whiteness, even if it's not explicitly depicted. And this also begins to teach students to think more critically about how the visual operates. Then I have a section where I talk about the dynamic between subjects and objects and how this is a fundamental aspect of art history insofar as we talk about objects. But the question of who constitutes an object and how we make this distinction between subjects and objects is a very fraught one, particularly in histories related to slavery and, again, other forms of oppression. So this could be a really interesting way, I think, to teach art history, is the question of subjects versus objects, artists having agency, but then how artists objectify people in their work, for example. So this is something that I felt could fuel could be the underlying engine for a whole survey art history course, potentially, instead of talking about movements or instead of talking about artists as individuals. This sort of tension between subjects and objects could be the sort of primary driver of a historical accounting of the history of art. And then I conclude with two sort of more pedagogical questions. One section is called Showing Our Work. And this is something that I believe really is really important for my teaching, I believe really strongly in, is that it's really important to show students the types of thought process that we go through in presenting material to them, rather than presenting the material as common sense or that necessarily that we have all the expertise, because it shows them that these types of questions that we're dealing with require vulnerability, they require relearning, there are things that require different types of questioning. And that's really an important way, I think, which we can dismantle sort of the assumption of that the professor has a sort of mastery over the material, or that we as educators have to know everything about every single topic. It can be really powerful to help students, to show students that like we're still working through these ideas as well. And then finally, I think it's really important to find ways to put our students within our teaching practices. So whether that's about creating assignments that allow them to sort of connect the material to what they're doing in their everyday lives, or to encourage them to question us and to show, again, to sort of step down from that place of authority and give them the agency to frame the material around the things that are really concerning to them. I think it's really important. So again, yeah, that's just a broad overview of many of the topics that I wanted to that I brought up in the essay, but I'm excited to hear from the folks who are assembled here, whether or not you have things that you've struggled with in the classroom in trying to raise issues around white supremacy or integrating a more diverse course or diverse perspectives into your courses, or if you have experiences with any of these issues that you would like to share that you think that other people here might benefit from hearing from. I think that would be really great.
Thank you so much. We have a question. Let's see. You spoke about having an art history background, but that your schooling emphasized pedagogy, perhaps more than in other programs. Can you speak to the programs that you were enrolled in, the MPhil and the PhD in art history at the Graduate Center? And would you recommend these programs for students looking to pursue their studies and compare them to what is offered at at perhaps at other places of study. I'm not entirely sure about the end. But I think the issue of social justice and pedagogy and art and higher education, right, and advanced education is an interesting one.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. I do think that in many ways, the program that I went to was unique in its emphasis on pedagogy. It's so early in our graduate studies. We took a class on pedagogy in our first year, but that's because it requires so much more teaching than other programs. Students teach their own courses very, very early on in their graduate career. So there's a sense that this is actually filling a practical purpose to get students through the program, and they have to carry a much heavier teaching burden than many other programs do. So I don't want to speak to other programs that I don't necessarily know that much about. I guess I should speak mostly about the program that I have. Yeah.
Maya, I got clarity on the end of the question,
Okay.
and it has to do with I guess sort of thinking about the traditions that take place or the teaching that takes place at a place like the Graduate Center at the Senior University of New York versus your current university, the University of Toronto.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for the clarification. I think, both universities are public universities, and so the funding for students is tied a lot to teaching. At least these are the two examples that I know of. So I think this question of what types of universities require what type of labor from students, and then how that leads to a certain type of teaching experience. But teaching experience doesn't always correlate with pedagogic training. So I think the question of whether or not, I would want to shift the question away from should you go to this one particular program if you're interested in pedagogy to should we demand that more universities integrate these types of questions into their training for art historians at the PhD level, in terms of if they're taking seriously questions around diversity and inclusion. I think it's more and more imperative that the graduate level teaching incorporate these larger questions, that it's not just about acquiring content and then you're going to be able to put together a course or lessons plans, but that you have to think really seriously about these larger issues in order to do it effectively and not just replicate the models that you had been taught maybe as an undergraduate, who knows how long ago that was, but that the department is really supporting you and thinking more broadly about how to ask these types of questions.
Olivia, this is a question for both Olivia and Maya. Olivia, you mentioned in your introduction the idea of cost of the textbook, of the cost of materials as a barrier, and as an inequity in and of itself. And I was just hoping you could both speak to this in your own experience and practice, because I think that's a critical question.
Sure. Yes. I mean, I can just speak from my, my lived experience and what I know about our students where I teach, that, some of our students are housing insecure, some of our students are food insecure, and they don't, not everyone is comfortable sharing that with an instructor. Some people are, and we do have resources available on campus to help those students in what way we can. But that was a big shift. It's interesting to kind of think about, your training as an art historian. So that was a big shift for me, from my educational background, coming from graduate school, and then, jumping really headlong into a full-time teaching position at a very different type of institution of higher learning. And yeah, so that it became clear to me over a course of several years that textbooks were definitely a barrier to engagement in several ways. So I think, students could be on one hand embarrassed that they couldn't afford the textbook. We would have other workarounds like putting a textbook in the library, for example. But, that's just sort of extra steps, right, to get the student to be able to engage with the material. And I think we noticed there just was a lack of engagement when your course is designed around a textbook versus like Maya has put forth so articulately, rather these questions that engage the student in terms of how is this subject, why is this course relevant to my life? What am I getting out of this course? And really, how is it benefiting, my future and my understanding of myself, my community? and how I could contribute, to society going forward. But yeah, so cost was just sort of the most tangible one, I think, in some senses. And then a lot of times our students, I would find, wouldn't read the textbook because I think, there was a barrier to engagement in terms of also how students engage and the differences within how students engage with material, whether they're visual learners or more tactile learners even. So we had a lot of, I found a lot of barriers to engagement with the traditional textbook model. Maya, how about you?
Yeah, I think also during COVID, the question of the utility of a single textbook really, and also a lot of teaching practices in general for me really got thrown up in the air and had to rethink whether or not it was actually, if I was doing it because that's how I had been taught, or whether or not it was actually serving students.
Right.
But I do want to acknowledge that there is although it can be cost prohibitive for students, I do understand why professors use them, because particularly if you're at an institution where your primary job is teaching, you're teaching so many courses and the labor demanded on professors is increasingly high. And teaching to a textbook can reduce some of the labor that is necessary to put a course together. And a lot of the things that I have suggested, or like some of the things that I'm talking about or reflecting on in the essay, are incredibly labor intensive because they require a lot of unlearning on the part of the professor and developing models that they may not exist. And so I think that that's really important to acknowledge, that there's issues on either side. There's the issue on the professor side, there's issue on the student side. But I think as much as possible, I try to give students PDFs of reading and not teach to a textbook, because it also allows me to introduce them to ideas that maybe haven't reached a textbook level yet. The textbook might be limited in its perspective as well. And I want to teach students to think in different ways than what a textbook might have to offer. Also, certain topics don't have textbooks in the same way. So if you're relying on a textbook, you might be reifying a Western vision of art history. So, or you might not be able to teach some topic that might not have the same level of material available. So there are lots of issues beyond just the cost, I think, although the cost is quite real and important.
We have a question that sort of piggybacks on this, which is related, and you've both used the term voice, and sort of the voice of the author. And the reader is interesting in that each essay is signed, and distinct from the textbook, where there may be a general editor, there may be some sub-editors, but there is no individual voice. And it seems to link to the issue that you raised earlier about students recognizing themselves in the art history or the cultures that are being studied. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to perhaps the way in which the BIPOC reader starts to dismantle that omnipresent voice of the textbook.
Great question. I guess that's for me in a way.
I think for both of you, because I think there's there's an equity piece here, right?
Yeah, I think just first to be transparent about who is speaking. I think that's a very clear distinction, perhaps, between just the format of a textbook versus essays and articles on smart history, for example, and within the BIPOC reader. And we talk about this, for example, in my class, first day is sort of just think about what a textbook is and how it presents material and how we tend to receive that information versus, knowing the individual author and their perspective and being able to, I see a question coming, being able to then go and read their biography, see sort of where, their training lies, where their research interest lies. And I think the hope is also that not only can students see themselves in the material, but also see themselves in being able to go on to be the ones writing essays, to be interpreting pieces of art, and to see themselves in the field. I think that's also really important for us.
We have a couple of questions. Let me just jump in here. Can you talk about starting points? Students come to the classroom with such different assumptions and experiences about race. And as you say, making method explicit in a way to invite them into the conversation when a course begins also sets so many things in motion. I'd love to hear you both reflect on on what has and has not been effective in moving towards a new trajectory for art history?
Yeah, I'll give one example that I use for a teaching strategy that I use, which is I teach a history of Black art it used to be in the United States, but since I've moved to Canada, it's in North America. This is my main survey class that I teach, and in making this shift from teaching in the U.S. to teaching in Canada, I realized that I was operating under a whole set of assumptions about what students knew about slavery and how they talked about race that I couldn't take for granted anymore. In moving to a different country, because I literally didn't know what students were taught here prior to the collegiate level. So before I start the class, I send everybody a survey. It's maybe like 5 minutes in Microsoft Forms, because that's the platform we use here at U of T. And I ask them very explicit questions like, have you taken art history before? Have you taken a class in African diaspora, African American studies before? Were you taught about the history of slavery in your class before, in any class before, whether at the collegiate level or in the high school level? And then I ask them a few other questions too, like their astrological sign and whatnot. But then I present the findings to the class on the first day of class. And I say to everybody, like, this is where we're all at. Like, this is and it's anonymized. So even I don't know who's answering. But I show everybody, like, some people may have a background in art history, but they don't have a background in African American studies. Like, that's the vast majority of the students that I have. And so I say, it's really important for you to have that background, because maybe if a student says something that you think is offensive, it gives you context to understand that they just might not have the language or the background to understand how to say that what they're saying is offensive. And so, like, can we approach each other from a place of grace and a place of wanting to inform and be open to people having new intellectual experiences? But I think that really helps to sort of humanize the class and get us a sense of, this is where it's not about a starting point in terms of where you start the history of art, but it is a starting point in terms of building class community. And again, the basis for having conversation, I think it deflates the sense of maybe that anxiety that students might have about, like, I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing, I'm afraid of offending somebody. And it's something that I really appreciate too, just for myself, knowing, okay, these are things that I can take for granted or not take for granted. This is how I need to frame certain types of conversations for students.
Olivia, did you want to add, or should we move?
I think that's awesome. I guess maybe, Tess, to go back to your question, just starting points. I think having the students come to their own determinations in a way. I mean, again, and I think this is a very, like, anti-racist model, right? Of rather the sage on the stage, right? Is really having the students draw upon their own observations to be able to, really determine what an image, for example, is saying to them. Just in terms of very practical things, if we're going to get down to nitty-gritties, I think small group work can be really helpful, because, again, like Maya was also saying, it really kind of take some of that tension out of the air, having a student, let's say, feel like they need to raise their hand to ask a question in front of the whole class. So allowing students to really converse among themselves and have a more intimate modality to raise questions and to get to know one another. And then, I think also I think that idea of, like, giving everyone a little bit of grace and allowing them to be accepted for where they're at, but also give them that opportunity to grow over time, to grow over the semester, to feel as if, they're not there to have an agenda foisted upon them, but rather for them to be able to derive from the course what is meaningful to them, and then to allow themselves to be challenged, perhaps, and to become vulnerable to the point where they're comfortable with, growing again as a student. So it is difficult, it's tricky. We could probably talk for 3 hours about this topic, but I really liked what Maya had suggested about sort of kind of allowing that honesty about everyone's starting points and the diversity within that. And that's okay, right? And that's part of, why we're at college, why we're there, and the whole goal of education.
Thank you. Just wanted to acknowledge that you got a very nice comment about the importance of the OER and its importance in the administrative push for more OERs. There was another question which Maya responded to already that had to do, but I had a part to answer in it, so I wanted to just jump in, which was, what is Smart History's thinking in terms of moving beyond English? And Smart History is increasingly global, not only in its content, but in its audience. About 50% of Smart History's audience is now outside of the United States. And huge numbers of people from Brazil, so there's Portuguese, people from the Philippines, from all over the world. And it is an increasing challenge. We are actually starting an initiative to be translated into Chinese. Some content is already being translated into Russian, into Polish, into Turkish, into Spanish. It's just an issue of cost and sort of effort, and it's something that we're cognizant of and appreciate the need for, and are working towards that. But it is a big project, because not only you don't want to do a direct translation, you want to do something that is idiomatically correct and that is art historically accurate, and so it's a bit of a trick. So thank you for your question. The last response was from just an enormous thank you. We're actually out of time, so I don't want to continue, but much longer. But let me just say that, let's see, I appreciate your work. This is the last question we'll have a chance for. Appreciate your work. This is the first year that I give my course in art history to undergraduate students in Thailand. Here, art history has no place in high school curriculum. So the first year undergraduate students will simply face art history for the first time. It's pretty difficult to connect with students, especially with Western art history, and relate themselves to it. I'll be grateful to hear your experience on letting students relate themselves with art history, especially the Western part. So yeah, what do you do when you have students who are culturally at a distance from the work that you're expected to teach?
Yeah, I think for me, again, just not to beat a dead horse, but I think it is really important to get a sense from them directly as to why they're interested in the topic. I mean, it might be that it's because it's a requirement, but that's also illuminating as well. Like, why do we value, why would you think that this type of course would be a requirement? What types of lessons do you think are important that we're gaining from this class? And I think also, just in general, again, this has been a lesson of the pandemic for me, that when I teach, it's really more what I want my students to take away are skills. And so I want them to learn how to be good readers. I want them to learn how to be really astute visual analysts, because the visual is so much a part of their world outside of the classroom. That those things don't have a cultural valence the same way that a topic on European versus Thai or Southeast Asian art might, Southeast Asian art. So I think, thinking about the balance of those two things within any curriculum, what content am I teaching, but also what skills am I teaching, and how am I empowering my students, not just to build a body of knowledge, but to be critical thinkers. I think that can be a really important way into sort of taking a material that students may not feel is relevant to their everyday lives, and still showing them the relevancy of the discipline in other ways.
Yeah, that's such a great point, Maya. And I'll just piggyback on that to say, one of my favorite strategies too to connect with students is to pull in contemporary artists. One, because again, the whole concept of, a person being able to speak back against this tradition, which is so heavily biased. And then I think it does really help connect students to feel like, this material is relevant again to their lives, and that we can have these really productive conversations about power, about colonialism, about gender, through a lens that's more accessible for them, in terms of, being able to go on Instagram, let's say, or TikTok, and see what's there, what's being produced here and now, and the artists that are really having this opportunity and platforms now too, to be able to speak back against the historical canon, and to see how conversations get generated from that comparison, from those juxtapositions.
I want to thank everybody who attended. Thank our two amazing speakers for their incredible work and for sharing their experiences with us. It's really terrific. And just a reminder that our next webinar will be Black Pharaohs, Nubia, Egypt, Historical Racism with Dr. Stuart Tyson. It was previously scheduled for November 1st. It will be rescheduled. I just want everybody to be aware of that, and we'll have information about that on the website soon. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Stephen. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.